December 12, 1945. The coldest winter in recorded history descended upon the Colorado Rockies. In prisoner of war camps across America, German soldiers prepared for eventual repatriation to their defeated homeland. But in a remote facility nestled 8,000 feet above sea level, something far more immediate than politics threatened 70 German women prisoners. They were freezing to death. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They were members of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, captured during the final chaotic months of the war in Europe. Young women who had served the Reich as nurses, radio operators, and administrative personnel, now facing a mountain winter that showed no mercy to friend or enemy alike. The camp's coal supply had run out 3 days earlier, and the promised delivery trucks were stranded 200 miles away by impassable roads and wartime fuel rationing. What could possibly save enemy prisoners when their own captors were powerless to help them? Before we discover what happened to these remarkable women, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins on that bitter December morning when 26-year-old Anna Richter stood at the frost-covered window of Barrack C, watching her breath crystallize in the air before her face. She wore every piece of clothing she owned layered beneath her gray auxiliary uniform coat, yet still she shivered uncontrollably. Anna had been a librarian in Berlin before the war, a quiet woman who had loved books more than politics, who had joined the auxiliary service believing she was simply helping her country survive. Now, captured in France during the Allied advance and transported across an ocean to these impossible mountains, she found herself in a different kind of survival situation entirely. Captain Margaret Sullivan, the camp's commanding officer, stood in her own unheated office, reviewing the weather reports with growing dread. A West Point graduate, and one of the few women to command a POW facility, she had always prided herself on following regulations precisely. But no regulation addressed what to do when enemy prisoners faced death by freezing and military supply chains had completely failed. The thermometer outside her window read -8 degrees Fahrenheit, and the forecast predicted it would drop to -25 within 48 hours. In the camp's main compound, 70 German women had begun burning whatever wood they could find. Furniture legs disappeared into makeshift stoves. Wooden crates that once held supplies were broken apart and rationed like precious currency. Frida Hartmann, at 34 the eldest among them, organized the younger women into groups that would share body heat during the night, rotating positions so that everyone got time in the warmer center of their human clusters. Corporal James Morrison, a farm boy from Iowa assigned as one of the camp guards, watched the German women's desperate measures with growing unease. He had seen cattle freeze to death in winter storms back home. He recognized the early signs of hypothermia in several of the prisoners, the confusion and lethargy that preceded the final sleep. Something in his conscience would not allow him to simply watch these women die, regardless of what uniform they had once worn. But salvation, when it came, would arrive from an unexpected direction entirely. High above the prison compound, in a cabin built from hand-hewn logs a generation before the war began, William Mackenzie lowered his binoculars and frowned. The prisoners called him Bear, though few had ever met him face to face. At 62 years old, he had spent more than 40 years in these mountains, first as a trapper following his father's trade, then as a guide for hunters who came seeking elk and mountain lion. His Scottish accent had never fully disappeared, and his understanding of what it meant to be foreign in America ran deeper than most native-born citizens could comprehend. For 3 days now, Bear had noticed the absence of smoke from the camp's chimneys. At first he had assumed it was some change in routine, perhaps a different heating schedule. But watching through his binoculars as women in the compound below broke apart wooden structures and fed them into small fires, he understood what was happening. They were running out of fuel, and winter had only just begun. Bear was not alone in his observations. Throughout the scattered settlements that dotted these mountain valleys, other men had noticed the same thing. Daniel Forrest, who owned the largest sawmill in the county, had driven past the camp on his weekly supply run to town. He had seen the guards struggling with their own inadequate heating, seen the prisoners huddled in small groups around pathetic fires that produced more smoke than warmth. Daniel's feelings about German prisoners were complicated. His younger brother Michael had died on Omaha Beach 6 months after the invasion, cut down by machine gun fire from a bunker that took 3 hours to silence. The telegram had arrived on Daniel's 30th birthday, transforming what should have been a celebration into the worst day of his life. He had spent months afterward nursing a hatred for anything German, refusing to speak to Ernst Weber, the Austrian mountain guide whose accent reminded him too much of the enemy who had killed his brother. Yet watching those women freeze violated something deeper than his anger. His father had taught him that mountain code superseded all other loyalties. In the wilderness, you helped those in danger, period. Politics ended where survival began. Ernst Weber himself had been wrestling with similar thoughts. An Austrian immigrant who had come to America in 1932, he had watched with horror as his homeland was absorbed into Hitler's Germany. He had tried to enlist when America entered the war, but at 58 he was considered too old for combat duty. Now, seeing German-speaking women facing death in these mountains, he felt a responsibility that transcended nationality. On December 15th, as temperatures continued their relentless descent, Bear Mackenzie walked down from his cabin to Miller's trading post. It was time to call a council. The mountain men needed to decide whether enemy prisoners deserved the same code of survival that governed all life in these unforgiving peaks. The answer, Bear believed, would define who they were far more than any uniform or flag ever could. December 16th dawned with an ominous stillness that every mountain resident recognized. The sky had turned the peculiar shade of gray-yellow that preceded major storms, and the wind had died completely, as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath before unleashing violence. Captain Margaret Sullivan stood in the camp's communication room, reading the weather bulletin that had arrived via telegraph at dawn. The National Weather Service predicted a blizzard of historic proportions, with wind speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour and snowfall potentially reaching 8 feet. The storm would hit within 36 hours and could last up to 10 days. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the paper down. She had already sent urgent requests to Regional Command for emergency coal deliveries, but the responses had been discouraging. Every military facility in the region faced the same crisis. Fuel was being prioritized for hospitals and bases with American personnel. A small POW camp housing enemy women ranked near the bottom of the supply chain. One commander had written back with barely concealed contempt, suggesting that German prisoners could withstand German weather. But this was not German weather. This was Colorado mountain winter at 8,000 feet elevation, and it killed indiscriminately. In Barrack C, Anna Richter sat with her small journal, writing by the weak light filtering through frost-covered windows. Her fingers were so cold she could barely hold the pen, but she forced herself to document what was happening. If they died here, someone should know the truth. She wrote about Liesel Schmidt, the youngest among them at 20 years old, who cried herself to sleep each night calling for her mother. She wrote about Johanna Vogel, the gentle seamstress who had begun sharing her own meager food rations with weaker prisoners. She wrote about the terrible mathematics of survival, how they had calculated that their remaining burnable wood would last perhaps 5 more days if they rationed it carefully. Frida Hartmann, the maternal figure whom everyone called Mutti, had organized the women into work details. Some broke apart furniture. Others gathered every scrap of cloth that could be used for additional insulation. A third group, including Anna, inventoried their remaining resources with brutal honesty. They had food enough for 2 weeks. They had water from melted snow. But they had almost nothing left to burn, and the storm would trap them in place with no possibility of resupply. Corporal Morrison found Captain Sullivan in her office that evening, his face troubled. "Ma'am, I need to report something." He paused, choosing his words carefully. 3 of the prisoners are showing signs of frostbite. 2 more have developed respiratory infections from the cold. Our medical supplies are limited, and if this storm hits as predicted, we could lose people. Margaret looked at him steadily. "Enemy people, Corporal." "People, ma'am," he replied quietly. "Just people." She turned back to the window, watching darkness fall over the mountains, knowing he was right, knowing it changed nothing about her impossible situation. Miller's trading post sat at the confluence of 3 mountain valleys, a weathered structure that had served as the social hub for scattered homesteaders since 1897. On the evening of December 16th, 19 men gathered around the pot-bellied stove in the back room, their faces illuminated by kerosene lanterns that cast long shadows across rough wooden walls. Bear Mackenzie stood before them, his massive frame silhouetted against the stove's orange glow. He had called this council, and the responsibility of speaking first fell to him. "You all know why we're here," he began, his Scottish burr thickening as it always did when he felt strongly about something. "There's 70 women up at that camp who are going to freeze to death in the next week if somebody doesn't help them." "German women," someone muttered from the back. "Enemy women?" "Women," Bear replied firmly. "That's all that matters in these mountains. We don't let people freeze." "That's not who we are." Daniel Forrest shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. Every man in the room knew about his brother Michael. Some had attended the memorial service at the small church in Pine Ridge. They waited to hear what he would say, understanding that his voice carried particular weight in this discussion. "My brother died because of Germans," Daniel said slowly, each word carefully measured. "I've spent 6 months hating every single one of them. I still do, most days." He paused, staring at his calloused hands. "But Michael wouldn't want women to freeze to death because of him. He was better than that. We're supposed to be better than that." Ernst Weber spoke next, his Austrian accent soft but clear. "I came to America because I believed this country stood for something different, for treating people with dignity even when it's difficult. Especially when it's difficult." He looked around the room. "If we let those women die when we have the means to help them, we become what we're fighting against." Young Tommy Briggs, barely 18 and too young to have served in the war, raised his hand hesitantly. "My pa always said mountain code comes before everything else. You help people in trouble. That's just what you do." The debate continued for another hour. Some argued about limited resources, about how helping enemy prisoners might anger townspeople who had lost sons and brothers in the war. Others pointed out that these women were no longer combatants, that they were prisoners under American protection, that allowing them to freeze would be a stain on their own conscience regardless of nationality. Finally, Bear called for a decision. "All in favor of taking firewood to that camp tomorrow, raise your hand." Slowly, one by one, every hand in the room went up. Even those who had argued most vehemently against it could not, in the end, violate the fundamental code that governed life in these mountains. You did not let people freeze. December 17th arrived with that eerie pre-storm stillness intensifying. The sky pressed down like a lead weight, and the air tasted of snow yet to fall. At Miller's trading post, 3 trucks loaded with split firewood assembled before dawn. Bear Mackenzie had spent the entire night cutting and splitting alongside Daniel Forrest and 8 other men. Their breath had formed clouds in the freezing air as axes rose and fell in rhythmic precision, transforming logs into stove-sized pieces that would burn hot and long. Now, as pale winter sun struggled over the eastern peaks, 12 mountain men prepared to descend to the prison camp. They wore their work clothes, heavy canvas coats and wool hats, their hands already roughened by decades of hard labor. These were not soft men. They were forged by altitude and isolation, by winters that tested human limits, by a landscape that showed no mercy to weakness. Bear rode in the lead truck beside Daniel, who gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. Neither man spoke. Behind them, Ernst Weber sat with Tommy Briggs and 4 others, while the third truck carried the remaining men and additional supplies, blankets and medicine that Mary Beth Crow had contributed from her nursing stock. At the other camp, Private Tommy Walsh was the first to spot the approaching vehicles. He ran to find Corporal Morrison, who immediately alerted Captain Sullivan. She emerged from her office, confusion evident on her face as she watched 3 civilian trucks approach the main gate, their beds stacked high with firewood. The trucks stopped outside the fence. Bear Mackenzie climbed down slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening. He approached the gate where Captain Sullivan now stood, flanked by Morrison and 2 other guards with rifles held loosely across their chests. "Ma'am," Bear said, removing his hat respectfully. "My name's William Mackenzie. These men and we've brought firewood for your prisoners." Margaret stared at him, momentarily speechless. Behind her, she could hear movement as word spread through the camp. German women were emerging from their barracks, drawn by the sound of truck engines, their thin faces appearing at windows and doorways. "Mr. Mackenzie," she finally managed. "I don't understand. These are enemy prisoners." "Yes, ma'am," Bear replied. "But they're people facing a mountain winter without heat, and that's something we can't abide. We're not asking for payment. We're not asking for anything except permission to unload this wood where your prisoners can use it." Daniel Forrest had joined Bear at the gate. Margaret recognized him from town, knew about his brother. Their eyes met, and in that moment she understood the weight of what these men were offering. They were choosing humanity over hatred, mountain code over politics. "Open the gate," she said quietly to Morrison. As the locks disengaged and the metal barrier swung wide, Anna Richter watched from Barrack C with tears streaming down her frozen cheeks. The first snowflakes began falling at 3 o'clock that afternoon, gentle and deceptive, drifting down like feathers from a torn pillow. By 4 o'clock, the wind had arrived, transforming those gentle flakes into horizontal needles of ice. By 5 o'clock, visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet, and the temperature had plummeted 20 degrees in a single hour. Bear Mackenzie stood in the camp's main hall, listening to the building groan under wind pressure. The mountain men had unloaded 2 truckloads of firewood before the storm hit with unexpected speed and fury. Now, attempting to return home would be suicide. Captain Sullivan had made the decision quickly, ordering the civilians to shelter in place alongside guards and prisoners until the blizzard passed. The main hall, designed to hold perhaps 40 people comfortably, now housed nearly 100 souls. German prisoners sat along one wall, American guards along another, and mountain men occupied the space near the door. The divisions were instinctive, tribal, each group gravitating toward their own kind despite the forced intimacy of their situation. Anna Richter sat between Johanna Vogel and young Liesel Schmidt, acutely aware of the men, who had brought salvation sitting just 20 feet away. She wanted to thank them, to express gratitude that transcended language. But fear and uncertainty kept her silent. These men had shown inexplicable kindness, yet they were still Americans, still the enemy of everything she had been taught to believe. Corporal Morrison began distributing the evening meal, thin soup and hard bread that represented their carefully rationed supplies. When he reached the mountain men, Bear waved him off. "We brought our own provisions, son. Save it for those who need it more." Ernst Weber, sitting beside Bear, pulled out a canvas sack containing smoked venison and dried apples. "We mountain folk know how to prepare for weather," he said in his accented English, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet hall. He looked directly at the German prisoners as he spoke. "In these mountains we share what we have when people are in need." Frieda Hartmann, the maternal figure among the prisoners, stood, slowly. Her English was limited, but she had been practicing with Anna for weeks. "Danke," she said clearly, then added in careful, heavily accented words, "Thank you for wood, for life." The simple statement broke something in the room's tension. Daniel Forrest, who had been staring at the floor since they arrived, looked up at the German women. He saw not enemy soldiers but exhausted, frightened young women who reminded him painfully of his sister back home. One of them, Liesel, looked barely older than his niece. "You're welcome," he said quietly, and though his voice was rough with emotion, the words were genuine. Outside, the storm intensified into a howling white darkness that would trap them together for 8 days. But inside, warmed by the firewood these mountain men had brought, something unprecedented began to happen. On the 3rd day of the storm, the camp's main barracks suffered catastrophic damage. A massive pine tree, weighted beyond endurance by accumulated snow and ice, crashed through the roof of Barrack A at 4 in the morning. The sound was like artillery fire, jolting everyone awake. 30 women fled into the blizzard wearing only nightclothes, their screams barely audible over the wind's roar. Bear Mackenzie reacted with the instinct of someone who had survived 40 years in these mountains. He organized the rescue immediately, sending Morrison and 2 guards to guide the displaced women to safety while he assessed the damage. A gaping hole now exposed the barracks' interior to sub-zero wind and driving snow. If left unrepaired, the entire structure would be uninhabitable within hours, and there was nowhere else to house 30 additional people. "We need to patch that roof before sunrise," Bear announced, "or we'll lose the whole building." Daniel Forrest was already pulling on his coat. "I'll need help. At least 6 people who know their way around construction." To everyone's surprise, Anna Richter stepped forward. "I can help," she said in careful English. "In Berlin, my father was carpenter. He taught me." Johanna Vogel joined her. "I sewed canvas for Wehrmacht tents. I understand waterproofing." Within minutes, an unlikely crew assembled. Mountain men worked alongside German prisoners, directed by Daniel's experienced eye and Bear's mountain wisdom. They salvaged canvas tarps from storage, cut timber from the firewood supply, and improvised repairs using whatever materials the camp could provide. Anna found herself working directly beside Daniel, holding boards steady while he hammered. The physical labor warmed her despite the bitter cold, and she discovered unexpected competence in tasks she had never imagined performing. Daniel, for his part, found himself instructing this enemy woman with the same patience he had once shown his brother Michael when teaching him the sawmill trade. "Angle it more to the left," he said, demonstrating with his hands when words failed. Anna understood immediately, adjusting her grip with precision. Ernst Weber worked with Tommy Walsh, the young American guard, teaching him techniques for securing canvas against mountain winds. "In Austria, in the Alps, we learn these things as children," Ernst explained. "The mountains teach you, or they kill you." As dawn broke on a landscape transformed into an alien white wilderness, the repair crew stood back to examine their work. The patch was crude but functional, sealed with tar that Ernst had melted over one of the fires. It would hold until proper repairs could be made after the storm passed. Johanna approached Daniel hesitantly, her face exhausted but grateful. She held out her hand in the universal gesture of respect and thanks. Daniel looked at that extended hand for a long moment, seeing in it everything he had been taught to hate, everything he was learning to see differently. Finally, he grasped it firmly. "Good work," he said simply. She smiled, understanding transcending language barriers. On December 24th, the 8th day of the storm, the wind finally died. Silence descended over the camp like a benediction, broken only by the occasional crack of ice-laden branches surrendering to gravity. The snow had stopped falling sometime during the night, leaving behind a world transformed into crystalline sculpture. Drifts reached 15 feet in places, burying fences and obscuring the camp's boundaries, until it seemed the whole world had become one unbroken expanse of white. Bear Mackenzie stood at the main hall window, watching sunrise paint the snow gold and pink. Behind him, the mountain men prepared to attempt the journey home. The roads would be impassable for vehicles, but on snowshoes they could make it to their cabins and homesteads within a day or two of hard travel. Captain Sullivan approached him quietly. "Mr. Mackenzie, I need to know something. Why did you really do this? Why risk your lives for enemy prisoners?" Bear turned to face her, his weathered face thoughtful. "Ma'am, I came to America from Scotland when I was 20 years old. Came with nothing but the clothes on my back and an accent that made people suspicious. Mountain folk took me in, taught me how to survive here, never once asked where I was from or what I believed. They just saw someone who needed help." He paused, looking past her to where the German women were organizing their barracks. Those women, they're foreign in a foreign land, caught up in something bigger than they understood. How could I not help them when I know exactly what that feels like? The mountain men gathered their gear, preparing to depart. Anna Richter watched them from across the hall, her journal clutched against her chest. For 8 days, she had observed these rough, quiet men who had shown more humanity than she had ever witnessed during her years serving the Reich. She had written pages about them, trying to understand what kind of people chose kindness over hatred, especially when hatred would have been so much easier. Ernst Weber noticed her watching. He approached slowly, respectfully. "Fräulein, you write much in your book, yes?" Anna nodded, surprised he had addressed her in German. "I am trying to understand what happened here. Why you helped us." Ernst smiled sadly. "Because we are all just people trying to survive the winter. Politics and war, they are things that happen far away. But here, In these mountains, there is only the code. You help those in need. Always. Before the mountain men left, Frieda Hartmann gathered all 70 German women in the compound yard. They stood in formation, not as soldiers but as grateful survivors. As Bear and his companions walked toward the gate with their snowshoes and packs, the women began to sing. It was a German folk song, Der Gut Kamerad, but they sang it as tribute rather than defiance, their voices carrying across the pristine snow. Bear stopped at the gate, listening. Daniel Forrest stood beside him, tears freezing on his cheeks. Neither man spoke, but both understood that something profound had shifted during those 8 days trapped together. They had entered the storm as enemies and emerged as something else entirely, something without a proper name but recognized by the heart. January brought a cold so profound that water froze solid within seconds of being poured. But inside the camp barracks, warmed by the firewood that mountain men continued to deliver every week, the German women faced the winter with new resilience. What began as survival had evolved into something more complex, something that defied the simple categories of captor and captive, enemy and ally. Anna Richter sat at a makeshift desk fashioned from packing crates, composing a letter she had been mentally drafting for 3 weeks. Her English had improved dramatically through daily practice with Corporal Morrison, but this letter required precision beyond her current skills. She wanted Bear Mackenzie to understand what his kindness had meant, not just materially but spiritually, to women who had believed themselves beyond redemption. She wrote slowly, carefully, crossing out words, and starting again. Dear Mr. Mackenzie, I am writing to thank you for saving our lives. But more than this, you have given us something we did not expect to find in America, in captivity, or perhaps anywhere in this world that war has broken. You have shown us that humanity can exist between enemies, that kindness does not require agreement or shared nationality, only shared recognition of our common struggle to survive and find meaning. When she finished, she showed the letter to Johanna Vogel, whose artistic sensibility helped refine the phrasing. Together, they crafted something that transcended mere gratitude, something that attempted to bridge the chasm between their worlds. Captain Sullivan, when asked to approve the letter's delivery, read it with growing emotion. She had witnessed the transformation in the prisoners over the past month, how they carried themselves differently now, with less defeat and more purpose. The letters, she decided, were part of that transformation. She approved not just Anna's letter but encouraged other prisoners to write if they wished. Within a week, Bear Mackenzie received 7 letters at Miller's trading post. He sat by his cabin fire that evening, reading each one slowly, his calloused fingers careful with the delicate paper. These women wrote about more than gratitude. They wrote about discovering that the America they had been taught to hate was nothing like the propaganda had claimed. They wrote about small kindnesses from guards like Morrison and Walsh. They wrote about learning to see beyond uniforms and accents to the humans underneath. Bear responded to Anna's letter with his own careful prose. Miss Richter, we did what any decent folk would do when others face hardship. The mountains teach us that survival requires cooperation, that strength comes from helping rather than harming. Perhaps if more people lived in places where nature forces such lessons, there would be fewer wars. Daniel Forrest, hearing about the correspondence, surprised everyone by writing to Johanna. His letter was shorter, less philosophical. Miss Vogel, working beside you during the storm reminded me that my brother died fighting an idea, not fighting people like you. I think he would approve of what we did. I think he would want me to see you as a person first, an enemy second. Maybe not an enemy at all anymore. The letters continued throughout that brutal winter, creating connections that would prove more durable than anyone imagined. Words on paper built bridges that physical proximity alone could never have constructed, allowing former enemies to explore their shared humanity through careful, honest communication. 25 years later, on a bright June morning in 1970, Anna Richter Forrest stood before a crowd of 200 people gathered at what had once been the Colorado prison camp. The barracks had been preserved as a historical site, a testament to an unlikely story of humanity transcending hatred during America's darkest hour of global conflict. Beside her stood Daniel Forrest, her husband of 23 years, and their 3 children, all born in these mountains that had once seemed so alien and hostile. Their eldest daughter Margaret, named for Captain Sullivan, was studying medicine at the University of Colorado. Their twin sons, Michael and William, named for Daniel's brother and Bear Mackenzie, worked at their father's expanded sawmill operation. The dedication ceremony honored Bear Mackenzie and the 12 mountain men who had chosen compassion over convenience that frozen December. Bear himself, now 87 years old, sat in the front row, his massive frame diminished by age but his eyes still sharp and knowing. Ernst Weber sat beside him, along with 6 other survivors from that original group. 5 had passed away, but their families had come to witness this recognition of their father's and husband's extraordinary choice. Anna approached the podium, her English now flawless after decades of immersion, though traces of her German accent remained in certain words. She carried the same leather journal she had clutched throughout that terrible winter, its pages now yellowed but still legible. 25 years ago, she began, her voice steady and clear, 70 German women faced death in these mountains. We expected nothing from our captors except the bare minimum required by international law. We certainly did not expect kindness. We did not expect men who had every reason to hate us to risk their own safety bringing us firewood through an approaching blizzard. She paused, looking at Bear. Mr. Mackenzie taught us something that changed the course of our lives. He taught us that humanity exists independent of politics, that the human capacity for compassion can survive even the worst that history throws at us. He and these mountain men showed us what America truly meant, not through speeches or propaganda, but through simple actions that honored the dignity of every person, even enemies. Johanna Vogel-Schmidt sat in the audience beside her husband, a local carpenter she had married in 1948. Liesel, the youngest prisoner who had once cried herself to sleep, now taught German at the high school in Pine Ridge. Frida Hartmann had passed away in 1963, but her daughter, born in America in 1947, attended the ceremony with her own children. Of the 70 German women who had survived that winter, 42 had chosen to remain in America after the war ended. Most had settled in Colorado, finding something in these mountains that felt like home. They had become nurses, teachers, seamstresses, and businesswomen. They had married, raised families, and contributed to their communities in countless quiet ways. Anna concluded her speech by holding up her journal. In this book, I wrote a question during that frozen December. What kind of people choose kindness when hatred would be easier? 25 years later, I have my answer. Good people. Simply good people who understood that our shared humanity matters more than our temporary enmities.